In the dust-choked plains of the Arizona Territory, where the law was often as barren as the land itself, a woman's grit was her only true currency. For Eliza Jane Thompson, a widow clinging to her late husband's dream, that grit was about to be tested by fire and blood. When a wounded Apache warrior, a specter from the very wilderness that had claimed her husband, collapsed on her doorstep with a posse hot on his trail, she was faced with a choice that would rewrite her destiny: to follow the prejudices of her time and hand him over to a certain death, or to defy a ruthless cattle baron and the corrupt lawman in his pocket by hiding a fugitive under her own floorboards. What she didn't know was that this single act of defiance would ignite a war, and her only hope for survival would be the very man she had hidden from the world. The wind in the Verde Valley was a relentless thief. It stole the moisture from the earth, the hope from a woman's heart, and now it was stealing Eliza Jane Thompson's cattle. From the porch of the modest ranch house her husband Thomas had built with his own 2 hands, she watched the dust devils dance across the parched land. The Triple T, their shared dream, was withering before her eyes. It had been a year since the Apache raid that had left her a widow. A year of solitary struggle against the unforgiving land and the even more unforgiving ambitions of men. Her nearest neighbor, the formidable Silas Blackwood, owner of the sprawling Blackwood Cattle Company, had made no secret of his desire for her land and its precious access to the Verde River. His offers to buy her out, delivered with a smile as thin and sharp as a shard of glass, had become more frequent, more insistent. Blackwood's foreman, a bull of a man named Jedediah Jed Stone, was a constant menacing presence. His riders, a pack of rough-hewn men with cruel eyes, patrolled the borders of the Triple T, their intentions as clear as the vultures circling overhead. Fences were cut, a small but vital waterhole was mysteriously fouled, and her cattle, once a herd of over 200, had dwindled to a few dozen scrawny beasts. The local law sheriff Brody of Verde Creek, a man whose spine seemed to have been replaced by a leather thong, offered sympathetic shrugs and empty promises. Eliza knew he was in Blackwood's pocket, another cog in the cattle baron's relentless machine. One sweltering afternoon, the sky turned a bruised, sickly yellow. A dust storm, one of the behemoths that could strip the paint from a wagon, and a man of his senses was rolling in. Eliza, with the help of her one remaining loyal ranch hand, a grizzled old-timer named Jebediah Finch, worked frantically to secure what little remained of her herd. As the first tendrils of the storm clawed at the ranch house, a figure emerged from the swirling chaos. He was tall and lean, moving with a desperate, loping gait. An Apache. His buckskin leggings were torn and stained, and one hand was pressed tightly to his side, a dark crimson flower blooming between his fingers. He stumbled and fell not 50 yards from her porch. Behind him, through the thickening dust, came the sound of hoofbeats and the guttural shouts of men. A posse. Jed Stone's men. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through Eliza's exhaustion. The memory of Thomas lying lifeless in the dust, his face a mask of surprise and pain, flashed through her mind. Every instinct screamed at her to run to bar the door, to let the wilderness deal with its own. But then the Apache looked up, his eyes dark and filled with a pain that transcended the physical met hers. He was young, no older than 20, his face a mask of defiant agony. He was not the monstrous savage of the dime novels and the whispered fears of the settlers. He was a man wounded and hunted. In that fleeting moment, a different instinct took hold, a stubborn defiance that had been kindled in the embers of her grief. She would not let Silas Blackwood win. Not this time. "Jebediah, get inside!" she yelled over the rising shriek of the wind. With a strength she didn't know she possessed, she ran to the fallen man. He flinched as she approached his hand, instinctively reaching for the knife at his belt. "I won't hurt you," she said, her voice strained. "They will." He seemed to understand. With a grunt of pain, he allowed her to help him to his feet. He was heavier than he looked, a dead weight of muscle and bone. She half dragged, half carried him into the ranch house, the dust storm swallowing them whole just as the posse crested the nearby ridge. The cellar. Thomas had shown it, to her once a relic from the original homestead. A small, dark space, hidden beneath a trap door under a large bearskin rug in the main room. It was their secret, a place to store preserves, and in times of trouble, a place to hide. With fumbling hands she pulled back the rug, lifted the heavy wooden door, and helped the wounded man down the steep, narrow steps. She handed him a canteen of water and a strip of dried jerky, before closing the door, replacing the rug, and praying it would be enough. Moments later, the porch boards groaned under the weight of heavy boots. Jed Stone's fist hammered on her door. "Mrs. Thompson. We're looking for an Apache renegade. Seen him come this way." Eliza took a deep breath, smoothed her apron, and opened the door. She met Jed's cruel, piggish eyes with a look of weary innocence. "Jed," she said, her voice steady. "There's a dust storm raging. I haven't seen anything but dirt and misery for the past hour." Jed's eyes narrowed, scanning the room behind her. "You sure about that? We tracked him right to your property line, and the storm wiped out any tracks, I'm sure." She counted her heart hammering against her ribs. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a ranch to keep from blowing away." Jed hesitated, his gaze lingering on the bearskin rug. For a heart-stopping moment, Eliza thought he knew. But then, with a grunt of frustration, he turned and stomped off the porch, his men following in his wake. As their hoofbeats faded into the howl of the storm, Eliza leaned against the closed door, her legs trembling. Below her feet, a silent, unseen presence was a testament to her reckless act of defiance. She had hidden a fugitive Apache under her floorboards, and in the suffocating darkness of that cellar, a desperate and dangerous alliance had just been forged. The dust storm that had served as a cloak for Eliza's secret alliance eventually blew itself out, leaving behind a world scrubbed clean and unnervingly silent. In the days that followed, a tense and fragile trust began to form in the claustrophobic confines of the cellar. His name he communicated through a combination of hand gestures, charcoal drawings on a piece of scrap wood, and a shared broken Spanish, was Goclia. He was a Chiricahua Apache, and the men who had pursued him were not a posse in the legal sense, but hired guns in the employ of Silas Blackwood. They had ambushed his small hunting party, and he had been separated from his kin in the ensuing chaos. Eliza, using a bottle of Thomas's whiskey as an antiseptic and strips of her own petticoats for bandages, tended to the gunshot wound in his side. It was a clean shot, the bullet having passed through without hitting bone, but the risk of infection was a constant unspoken fear. As she worked, she saw the intricate patterns of scars that crisscrossed his chest and arms, the markings of a warrior. Yet in his eyes, she saw not the savagery she had been taught to expect, but a quiet dignity, a fierce pride that even his pain could not extinguish. Up above, Silas Blackwood's shadow loomed ever larger. Angered by Eliza's continued defiance and Jed Stone's failure to capture the Apache rustler, he escalated his campaign of intimidation. He paid a personal visit to the Triple T, his hulking frame filling the doorway of her small home. Eliza Jane. He began his voice a low, cloying purr. A woman alone in these parts. It ain't safe. I'm prepared to make you a final, very generous offer for this place. Enough to see you settled comfortably back east where you belong. From his hiding place, Goklia heard the veiled threats, the condescending tone. He felt the vibrations of Blackwood's heavy boots on the floorboards above him, and in the muffled cadence of his voice, he recognized the language of the oppressor, a tongue he knew all too well. "This is my home." "Mr. Blackwood," Eliza replied, her voice unwavering. "I'm not selling." Blackwood's smile tightened. A pity, he said, his eyes glinting with malice. A real pity. His words were a promise, and he was quick to deliver on it. The following week, Jed Stone and his men stampeded what was left of Eliza's herd, driving the terrified animals into a rocky arroyo. Several were killed, their broken bodies a gruesome warning. The few ranch hands who had remained loyal to Eliza, their families threatened, and their meager wages no match for Blackwood's bribes, finally deserted her. Only old Jebediah Finch, his face a mask of grim determination, refused to leave. "That man's a vulture," Eliza he'd said, spitting a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. "He'll pick your bones clean if you let him." As Eliza's world shrank, the cellar became a strange sanctuary. Goklia, his strength slowly returning, began to repay her kindness in the only way he knew how. He couldn't fight for her, not yet, but he could teach her. In the dim light of a single lantern, he showed her how to read the subtle language of the land. He drew maps in the dirt floor of the cellar, teaching her the secret places where water could be found, even in the driest of seasons. He taught her how to move with the silence of a shadow, how to use the sun and the stars to find her way, how to distinguish the track of a deer from that of a wolf, the sign of a friend from that of a foe. He spoke of his people not as the bloodthirsty savages of popular imagination, but as a proud nation fighting for its survival. He spoke of his family, of his father, a great warrior named Taza, and his grandfather, the legendary Cochise. He spoke of the iron horse that was carving up their ancestral lands, and the White Eyes, who saw the Apache as little more than vermin to be exterminated. In turn, Eliza found herself speaking of Thomas, of their shared dreams for the Triple T, of her loneliness and her fear. A bond deeper than either of them could have anticipated was being forged in the shared darkness, a connection born of mutual desperation and a surprising, burgeoning respect. But their clandestine world could not remain hidden forever. Jed Stone, his pride wounded and his suspicions aroused, became obsessed with discovering Eliza's secret. He had found a small, discarded piece of buckskin near the barn, and a footprint that was too narrow, too moccasined to belong to any of the settlers he knew. He began to watch the ranch from a distance, his patience as vast as the desert itself. One afternoon, Sheriff Brody rode out to the Triple T, his face a mask of practiced concern. He didn't come to offer help, but to deliver another of Blackwood's veiled threats. "Ma'am," he said, avoiding her gaze, "folks in town are talking, saying you're being stubborn foolish even. A woman can't run a ranch like this on her own. Blackwood's offer is more than fair. You should take it before things get any worse." Eliza saw him then for what he truly was, a coward, a man who had traded his tin star for a cattle baron's favor. Her contempt was a cold, hard knot in her stomach. "Thank you for your concern, Sheriff," she said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "But I can manage my own affairs." That night, Goklia announced that he was well enough to travel. "I must go," he whispered, his hand resting on the hilt of his knife. "I must find my people. But I will not forget this. I will not forget you." He planned to leave under the cover of the next moonless night. A sense of impending loss, sharp and unexpected, pierced Eliza's heart. She had grown accustomed to his quiet presence beneath her feet, to the shared secrets and the silent understanding that had passed between them. But she knew he was right. His presence, if discovered, would be a death sentence for them both. The vulture's net was tightening, and their time had run out. The night of Goklia's planned departure was as black as the inside of a closed fist. The moon, a shy sliver, was veiled by a thick blanket of cloud, and the air was heavy with the scent of an impending rain. It was a perfect night for a silent escape. It was also, as it turned out, a perfect night for an ambush. Jed Stone, his suspicions festering into a certainty, had decided to take matters into his own hands. Fueled by a bottle of cheap whiskey and the goading of two of his most brutal companions, a lanky, sallow-faced man named Cletus and a hulking, simple-minded brute called Luther, he rode towards the Triple T. They weren't after cattle this time. They were after a secret. Inside the ranch house, Eliza and Goklia were preparing for his departure. She had packed a small satchel for him with food, a fresh bandage, and a small flask of water. A profound sadness hung between them, a silent acknowledgement of the bond they had forged and the chasm that separated their worlds. It was Goklia who sensed them first. He froze his head, cocked his eyes, fixed on the ceiling. He placed a single finger to his lips, his body coiling like a snake ready to strike. He had heard the one sound that a lifetime of survival had trained him to detect, the careless snap of a twig under a heavy booted foot. 3 men, he whispered, his voice barely a breath. "They are close." Eliza's blood ran cold. She extinguished the lantern, plunging the room into near total darkness, the only light coming from the dying embers in the hearth. The floorboards above the cellar creaked as she moved to the window, peering through a crack in the curtains. She could just make out their shadowy forms as they dismounted, moving towards the house with a predatory stealth that belied their drunken swagger. A tense, terrifying cat-and-mouse game began. Eliza, her mind racing, remembered the lessons Goklia had taught her. She moved silently to the back door, wedging a heavy iron poker under the handle. She nudged a loose floorboard near the fireplace, a trick Thomas had used to startle her, creating a loud groan that echoed through the silent house. Outside, Jed and his men paused, startled. "What was that?" Cletus hissed. "Probably just the house settling." Jed growled, though his confidence was shaken. "Luther, you go around back. Cletus with me. We're going in." A heavy boot slammed against the front door, the wood groaning in protest. Another kick and the lock splintered the door, flying open with a crash. Jed and Cletus stumbled in, their eyes struggling to adjust to the gloom. "Thompson, we know you're in here, and we know you ain't alone," Jed bellowed, his voice thick with whiskey and malice. From the cellar, Goklia faced a terrible choice. He could slip out the small cellar window at the back of the house and make his escape into the darkness, leaving Eliza to her fate. Or he could stay and fight to honor the debt he owed the woman who had saved his life. The choice was never really in question. As Jed and Cletus began to ransack the room, Overturning furniture and smashing what little of value Eliza possessed, Goklia pushed open the trapdoor. He emerged from the darkness like an avenging spirit, a silent, deadly whirlwind of buckskin and steel. He took Cletus down first, a single precise blow to the back of the neck with the butt of his knife. The man crumpled to the floor without a sound. Jed whirled around, his eyes wide with a mixture of shock and fury, as he finally laid eyes on the source of his obsession. "You," he roared, drawing his pistol. But Eliza, no longer a damsel in distress, had armed herself. She swung a heavy iron skillet with all her might, catching Jed's gun hand with a sickening crunch of bone. The pistol clattered to the floor. Jed howled in and rage, lunging for her. Just then, a thunderous crash came from the back of the house as Luther finally broke through the rear door. He charged into the room, a veritable mountain of a man, his eyes wild. The ensuing fight was a brutal, desperate ballet of violence. Goklia, though still not at his full strength, was a blur of motion, his knife flashing in the firelight. He ducked under a wild swing from Luther, his blade darting out to slice the tendons in the big man's leg. Luther roared and fell to one knee, clutching at the wound. Jed, however, was a different beast. He was a brawler fueled by a mean-spirited tenacity. He ignored the searing pain in his broken hand and tackled Eliza, sending them both crashing to the floor. His hands closed around her throat, his thumbs pressing down, cutting off her air. Goklia, having dispatched Luther, turned to see Eliza's plight. He leaped across the room, pulling Jed off her. The two men grappled, a desperate struggle for dominance. Jed, heavier and stronger, managed to pin Goklia against the wall. He drew a long, wicked-looking skinning knife from his belt. Eliza, gasping for air, saw the glint of the blade. She grabbed the fallen pistol, her hands trembling. She didn't know how to shoot, but she could use it as a club. She scrambled to her feet and brought the heavy barrel down on Jed's head. The blow was clumsy, but it was enough to daze him. In that split second, Goklia twisted, driving his own knife into Jed's shoulder. Jed screamed a high, piercing sound of agony and slumped to the floor unconscious. Silence descended, broken only by their ragged breaths and the soft moan of the wind outside. They had won, but the victory was short-lived. Goklia staggered back, his hand pressed to his side. In the struggle, Jed's knife had reopened his old wound. Blood seeped through his buckskin shirt, a fresh, dark stain. "You are hurt," Eliza whispered, rushing to his side. "It is nothing." He grunted, but the pallor of his skin betrayed his words. He knew, and she knew, that they were out of time. When Jed and his men were discovered, Blackwood would have all the justification he needed to bring the full force of his power down on them. He would no longer be a cattle baron trying to intimidate a widow. He would be a man avenging his men, a hero in the eyes of the other settlers. "I must go," Goklia said, his voice urgent. "Now. I will bring help. My people are not far. They are camped in the Dragoon Mountains." He tore a single striking hawk feather from the small bundle tied in his hair. "Watch for this. It will be my sign. I will return in 3 days. Hold on for 3 days." He clasped her arm, his dark eyes boring into hers. "You are a warrior, Eliza Jane Thompson. Do not let them take your home." And then he was gone, melting into the pre-dawn darkness, a wounded ghost leaving a trail of blood and a desperate promise in his wake. Eliza was left alone in the wreckage of her home with 3 unconscious and bleeding men, a reopened wound on her unlikely ally, and the terrifying knowledge that the siege of the Triple T was about to begin. 3 days. It felt like an eternity. The first light of dawn crept over the valley, its gentle pink and orange hues, a stark contrast to the scene of brutal carnage inside Eliza's home. The coppery smell of blood hung heavy in the air. Jed Stone and his 2 thugs lay bound and gagged on the floor, their groans a grim testament to the night's desperate struggle. Eliza knew that taking them to Sheriff Brody would be a fool's errand. It would be her word against theirs, and in the court of public opinion, swayed as it was by Blackwood's influence and the deep-seated fear of the Apache, she would be branded a traitor, an Indian lover. She was on her own. A cold, steely resolve settled over her. This was her land, her home. She would not be driven from it. The fear was still there, a cold knot in the pit of her stomach, but it was now overlaid with a fierce, protective anger. She was no longer just a widow trying to survive. She was a woman defending her life and her honor. Her first act was to drag the 3 men out to the smokehouse, a small, sturdy building with a heavy, lockable door. It would serve as a makeshift jail. As she worked, she saw a flicker of movement in the distance. It was old Jebediah Finch riding towards the ranch, a look of alarm on his weathered face. He had heard the commotion in the night. "Good Lord, Eliza," he exclaimed, his eyes taking in her bruised face and the blood stains on her dress. What in tarnation happened here? As she quickly explained, his alarm turned to a grim understanding. "That Blackwood," he spat. "He's finally shown his true colors. Well, he ain't taken this ranch without a fight. Not while I'm still drawing breath." Together they began to fortify the Triple T. They boarded up the windows, leaving small slits through which they could see and, if necessary, shoot. They barricaded the doors with heavy furniture. They hauled buckets of water from the well, knowing that Blackwood's next move would likely be to try and burn them out. Eliza, her mind sharp and clear, remembered Goklia's lessons. She thought about the layout of her land, the natural choke points, the areas of cover and concealment. They didn't have to wait long. By mid-afternoon, a rider was spotted on the horizon. Not a posse this time, but a lone man carrying a white flag. It was one of Blackwood's lieutenants, a man named Dawson. He stopped 100 yards from the house. "Mrs. Thompson," he yelled. "Silas Blackwood demands the return of his men. He knows what you've done. He knows you're harboring an Apache murderer. You have 1 hour to surrender, or we'll come and take you. And we won't be gentle. Go to hell," Jebediah yelled back, his voice cracking with defiance. The rider sneered, wheeled his horse around, and galloped away. The ultimatum had been delivered. The siege had officially begun. An hour later they came. At least 20 of Blackwood's men, a small army of hired guns, their faces hard and merciless. They fanned out, taking up positions behind the rocks and scrub that dotted the landscape surrounding the ranch house. The first shot came from a ridge to the east, the bullet thudding into the thick wooden wall of the house. Eliza and Jebediah, armed with Thomas's Winchester and an old shotgun, returned fire. Their shots carefully aimed, designed not to kill, but to deter. The day wore on in a tense, sporadic exchange of gunfire. Blackwood's men were cautious, testing their defenses, probing for weaknesses. Eliza, her heart pounding with every shot, found a strange, almost out-of-body calm descending upon her. She was no longer afraid. She was a warrior, just as Goklia had said. The first day bled into a long, terrifying night. They took turns sleeping, one always on watch. The silence was more unnerving than the gunfire, filled with the imagined sounds of men creeping through the darkness. The second day dawned hot and merciless. Their water supply was dwindling, and the heat inside the barricaded house was suffocating. Blackwood's men grew bolder. They made a concerted push, trying to get close enough to set fire to the house. Eliza and Jebediah, their faces grimed with sweat and gunpowder, held them back in a furious volley of shots. A bullet grazed Jebediah's arm, and Eliza quickly bandaged it, her hands steady. Hope began to fray at the edges. 2 days gone. 1 day left. Eliza found herself constantly scanning the horizon, her eyes searching the distant line of the Dragoon Mountains for a sign, a whisper of a promise being kept. She saw nothing but the heat haze and the circling vultures. On the morning of the 3rd day, the attack came with a renewed ferocity. Silas Blackwood himself had arrived, his portly figure a dark silhouette against the rising sun. He was tired of the waiting game. "Burn them out!" he roared, his voice carrying across the valley. His men, emboldened by his presence, advanced under a hail of covering fire. Several of them carried torches, their flames licking at the dry air. They were getting closer. The smell of burning pitch pine filled Eliza's nostrils. They were going to die. Jebediah. His face pale, but his eyes blazing. Looked at her. "It's been an honor, Eliza," he said, his voice thick with emotion. Eliza squeezed his hand, her own eyes stinging with tears. She raised the Winchester one last time, taking aim at a man who was about to hurl a torch onto the porch roof. And then she saw it. It wasn't a cloud of dust from a charging cavalry. It wasn't the glint of sunlight on a rifle barrel. It was something far more subtle, far more deadly. A single arrow fletched with a familiar hawk feather arched high into the air from a rocky outcrop to the north. It seemed to hang there for an eternity before plunging into the dust of the ranch yard, a silent, feathered declaration. Goklia's sign. Before the significance of the arrow could even register with Blackwood's men, the world erupted. A high, piercing war cry, a sound that seemed to tear the very fabric of the sky, echoed from the surrounding hills. It was answered by another, and then another, until the air was filled with the terrifying chorus of an Apache war party. They seemed to materialize from the very earth itself. Warriors on horseback, their faces painted for battle, descended from the ridges, their movements a blur of controlled chaos. They were a force of nature, a whirlwind of righteous fury. They fell upon Blackwood's men, not as a charging line, but as a flowing, deadly tide, striking from all directions at once. The organized assault of the hired guns dissolved into a panicked, desperate rout. These were men paid to bully and intimidate, not to fight a disciplined, determined war party on their own terms. Their courage, bought and paid for, evaporated in the face of the Apache onslaught. The battle for the Triple T was over. The siege was broken. Goklia had returned, and he had brought the tribe. The aftermath of the battle was a scene of stunning, brutal finality. The valley which moments before had echoed with the thunder of gunfire and the screams of men was now eerily silent, save for the panting of horses and the low moans of the wounded. Blackwood's hired army was shattered, its remnants scattered, captured, or dead. From the porch of her besieged home, Eliza watched as the Apache warriors, led by a tall, imposing figure with an air of regal authority, rounded up the last of the terrified gunmen. Goklia, his face a mask of grim satisfaction, walked towards her. His arm was in a sling, but he moved with the fluid grace of a man who was once again whole, once again among his own people. "I told you I would return," he said, his voice low and resonant. "You did," Eliza whispered, her heart overflowing with a gratitude so profound it left her breathless. The tall warrior who had led the charge dismounted and approached them. He was older than Goklia, with a face that was a road map of wisdom and hardship. His eyes, dark and piercing, held the weight of generations. "This is Nietzsche," Goklia said, with deep respect. "Son of Kochise, our chief." Nietzsche's gaze fell upon Eliza, and for a long moment he simply looked at her, his expression unreadable. Then he spoke, his voice a deep baritone that commanded attention. "The woman who hides a Chiricahua warrior from his enemies is a friend to the Chiricahua. You have shown great courage, Eliza Jane Thompson. Goklia has told us of your honor." From a woman on the verge of being burned out of her home, Eliza was now being addressed with formal respect by the leader of a people she had been taught to fear her entire life. The world had been turned on its head. Meanwhile, Silas Blackwood, the architect of all this misery, was being dragged from his hiding place behind a cluster of boulders. His fine suit was torn and covered in dust. His face was ashen with terror. The vulture had been caged. He was brought before Goklia, who looked down at the cowering cattle baron with a mixture of contempt and disgust. "This man's life is not mine to take," Goklia declared, his voice ringing with authority. He turned to Eliza. "He is your enemy. His fate belongs to you." All eyes turned to her. The Apache warriors, their faces impassive, waited for her judgment. Jebediah Finch, leaning weakly against a porch post, nodded his encouragement. Silas Blackwood, his arrogance stripped away, groveled in the dirt, pleading for his life. "Please, Mrs. Thompson. Eliza Jane, have mercy." It was just business, a misunderstanding. Eliza looked at the pathetic figure before her. She thought of Thomas, of her stolen cattle, of the terror and desperation she had endured. A part of her, a dark, vengeful part, wanted to see him pay with his life. But as she looked into Goklia's steady gaze, she knew that was not the way. That was Blackwood's way, not hers. "I am not a murderer, Mr. Blackwood," she said, her voice clear and cold as a mountain stream. "And I am not the law. But I will see that the law finds you." She turned to Nietzsche. "I will not hand him over to Sheriff Brody. He is a bought man. I will take him and his men to the territorial marshal in Prescott. I have witnesses," she said, gesturing to the captured gunman, "and I have proof of his crimes." A murmur of approval went through the assembled warriors. Nietzsche nodded slowly, a look of profound respect in his eyes. He had expected a call for vengeance for blood. Instead, he saw a commitment to a different kind of justice, a justice that his own people had so rarely been afforded. The showdown was over. The battle was won. But in the quiet aftermath, a new and far more complex challenge emerged. What was to become of this strange, unprecedented alliance between a lone white woman and the Chiricahua Apache? The future of the Triple T and perhaps a small corner of the Arizona Territory would be decided not by bullets, but by the choices they made in the coming days. The days that followed the battle were a strange and surreal interlude in the harsh rhythm of frontier life. The Triple T Ranch, once a symbol of Eliza's solitary struggle, was transformed into a bustling temporary camp. The Chiricahua warriors, their initial ferocity replaced by a watchful calm, moved about the valley, with a quiet purpose tending to their wounded, their ponies grazing peacefully alongside Eliza's few remaining cattle. Eliza, with the help of a grateful Jebediah, worked tirelessly her home, becoming an infirmary for the injured on both sides. She treated the wounds of Blackwood's men with the same care she gave to the Apache warriors, an act that did not go unnoticed by Naiche. The Apache chief, a man of few words, but deep insight, spent hours in quiet conversation with Eliza, with Goklia acting as their interpreter. He was fascinated by this woman, who defied every stereotype he had of the white eyes. She was not greedy for land, nor was she consumed by fear and hatred. She had risked everything for one of his own, not for profit or gain, but out of a simple, powerful sense of decency. "Our worlds are very different," Naiche said one evening, as they sat by a campfire under a canopy of brilliant desert stars. "The white man's world is a world of fences and paper of lines drawn on maps that say, 'This is mine, and this is not yours.' Our world is the earth and the sky, the water and the wind. We do not own the land. We belong to it." "I think I understand that better now," Eliza replied, looking out at the valley that she had fought so hard to protect. "This place, it's more than just property to me. It's a part of me." On the fourth day, a pact was made. It was not a treaty written on paper and signed with ink, for Naiche had seen too many of those promises broken. It was a pact of fire and earth, a sacred oath sworn between a chief and a rancher. Naiche stood before Eliza, the flames of the campfire illuminating the proud, sharp angles of his face. "The Chiricahua will not forget the kindness of Eliza Jane Thompson," he declared, his voice resonating with the weight of his authority. "This land, the land of the Triple T from the river to the high mesas, will be a place of peace. My people will not hunt here. Your cattle will be safe. Our warriors will be your eyes in the hills. No harm will come to you from the Apache." He then turned to his people and spoke in their native tongue, his words a powerful current that flowed through the assembled warriors. They raised their rifles and lances to the sky with a great cry, a sound not of war, but of affirmation. An unprecedented alliance had been sealed. The next morning it was time for goodbyes. Eliza, accompanied by Jebediah and a guard of 4 formidable Apache warriors, chosen by Naiche, prepared to transport Silas Blackwood and his 3 senior henchmen, Jed, Cletus, and Luther, to the territorial marshal in Prescott. The other captured gunmen, stripped of their weapons and horses, were sent walking back to Verde Creek, a humiliating defeat that would shatter Blackwood's reputation and power forever. The farewell between Eliza and Goklia was filled with a poignant, unspoken emotion. The bond forged in the darkness of the cellar and tested in the crucible of battle was deep and undeniable. They stood apart from the others, the morning sun casting long shadows across the valley. "Our paths are different," Goklia said, his gaze fixed on the distant mountains, the home he was returning to. "I am of the people. My life is with them." "I know," Eliza whispered, her heart aching with a bittersweet sadness. "And my life is here." He reached out and gently touched the hawk feather she had tucked into the leather band of her hat. The hawk flies high, but it always remembers the place where it found shelter. He turned and swung himself onto his pony with a fluid grace. He did not look back. He rode to join Naiche and the rest of the tribe, a proud warrior returning to his world. His honor restored, his debt repaid. Eliza watched them go, a great procession of horsemen winding their way out of the valley until they were just small specks disappearing into the vast, unforgiving beauty of the Arizona landscape. She was alone again, but not the same woman they had found. She was no longer just a widow struggling to survive. She was the architect of a fragile peace, a woman who had looked into the heart of the wilderness and found not an enemy, but an ally. She had a long ride to Prescott, ahead of her a future to rebuild and a legacy to protect. The legacy of the Triple T. The journey to Prescott was a moving fortress of quiet tension. 4 days on the trail with Silas Blackwood and his henchmen bound in the back of a sturdy wagon, their glares a constant, silent threat. Blackwood, stripped of his power, had retreated into a simmering, venomous silence. Jed Stone, his face a mask of sullen defeat, refused to meet Eliza's eyes. But it was the presence of her escort that truly defined the journey. The 4 Chiricahua warriors, hand-picked by Naichi, were specters of silent efficiency. They flanked the wagon on their wiry ponies, their eyes constantly scanning the horizon, missing nothing. They spoke little, their communication a series of subtle hand gestures and low gutturals, but their message to any who might consider intervening was brutally clear. Eliza Jane Thompson was under their protection. For Jebediah Finch, who drove the wagon with his shotgun resting across his lap, it was a constant source of marvel. "Never thought I'd see the day," he mumbled to Eliza on the second night as they watched the warriors melt into the darkness to take up their sentinel posts, riding alongside the Chiricahua as allies. "The world's gone plumb crazy." Or maybe Eliza replied, pulling her blanket tighter against the desert chill. "It's finally starting to make some sense." Their arrival in Prescott created a sensation. A lone woman and an old prospector, escorted by 4 imposing Apache warriors, delivering the most powerful cattle baron in the Verde Valley to the steps of the Territorial Marshal's office. Doors and windows flew open and a crowd gathered as Marshal Elias Thorne, a barrel-chested man with a formidable reputation and a sweeping handlebar mustache, emerged to see what all the commotion was about. Thorne's initial expression was one of profound skepticism. He listened, his arms crossed over his chest as Eliza, her voice clear and steady, laid out the accusations against Blackwood. "Ma'am," he said, his voice a low rumble of disbelief, "Silas Blackwood is a respected man. You're making some mighty serious claims." "I have proof," Marshal Eliza stated calmly. "And I have witnesses." She gestured to the wagon where Blackwood was now sputtering with indignant rage. "And I have him." The interrogation was long and grueling. Marshal Thorne, a man who trusted facts over feelings, separated the prisoners and questioned them for hours. But Eliza's story held unshakable in its details. It was Jed Stone facing the grim reality of a hangman's noose who finally shattered Blackwood's wall of denial. In exchange for a promise of leniency, he recounted the entire sordid affair. The rustling, the intimidation, the raid on the ranch, and Blackwood's explicit orders to take the Triple T by any means necessary. Jebediah's passionate, heartfelt testimony sealed it. The marshal, his skepticism replaced by a grim respect for the woman before him, officially charged Silas Blackwood and his men. The trial, held weeks later, became the most talked-about event in the territory's recent history. The courtroom was packed to the rafters, with ranchers, townsfolk, and journalists eager for a spectacle. Blackwood, flush with coin, had hired the best lawyer money could buy, a slick talker from back east, who painted Eliza as a hysterical, vengeful widow, an Apache lover who had conspired with savages to frame an innocent man. But when Eliza took the stand, a hush fell over the courtroom. She was not the wild-eyed woman the lawyer described. Dressed in a simple but dignified black dress, her hair pinned neatly, she spoke with a quiet authority that captivated the jury. She didn't speak of hatred or revenge. She spoke of her home, of her husband's dream, of her right to defend what was hers. She recounted the events with a precision that left the defense attorney scrambling. The turning point came when she was asked about Goklia. "Did you not harbor a fugitive, a murderous Apache renegade?" The lawyer sneered. Eliza met his gaze without flinching. "I gave shelter to a wounded man who was being hunted. He was not a renegade. He was a man of honor." An honor, she added, her eyes flicking to the defendant's table that Mr. Blackwood knows nothing about. The jury was out for less than 2 hours. The verdict was guilty on all counts. Silas Blackwood, the man who had once ruled the Verde Valley like a king, was sentenced to 20 years of hard labor in the sun-scorched hell of the Yuma Territorial Prison. His empire, built on a foundation of greed and fear, crumbled into dust. Eliza returned to the Triple T not just a victor, but a legend. With the substantial reparations ordered by the court, she began the slow, satisfying work of rebuilding. She bought new prime breeding stock, hired a full crew of loyal hands, and expanded the ranch house, adding a wide veranda where she could sit in the evenings. The Triple T thrived, becoming one of the most prosperous and respected ranches in the region. The pact with Nightshade became an enduring, unspoken truth of the valley. No Triple T cattle ever went missing. When a wildfire threatened her northern range, one dry summer a band of Apache warriors appeared as if from nowhere, helping her ranch hands create a fire break that saved her grazing lands. They asked for nothing in return and were gone by morning. Travelers learned that the lands of the Triple T were under a mysterious, inviolable protection. Years passed. The West was changing. The railroad came bringing more settlers, more fences, more towns. The Apache wars faded into memory, their heroes and tragedies immortalized in conflicting histories. Eliza grew older, her hair turning a stately silver, her hands bearing the marks of a life of hard work and determination. She never remarried, finding a deep and abiding contentment in the land she had fought for and the independence she had earned. She never saw Goklia again. She knew his path had been a difficult one, as the Chiricahua were eventually forced onto reservations, their old way of life extinguished. She prayed he had found some measure of peace, but the connection remained. Every few months, as regular as the changing of the seasons, she would find it. Sometimes on a fence post, sometimes on her doorstep, sometimes tucked into the mane of her favorite horse. A single perfect hawk feather. It was a ghost's whisper, a silent conversation across the years. It told her she was not forgotten. It reminded her of the desperate alliance forged in a dark cellar of the warrior who had kept his promise of the battle that had defined her life. One cool autumn evening, as a grandmother now telling stories to her foreman's wide-eyed children, Eliza sat on her porch looking out at the valley bathed in the golden light of the setting sun. The children, captivated, had just heard the tale of the siege. "Were you scared?" Miss Eliza, one of the little girls, asked. Eliza smiled, a gentle, knowing expression on her weathered face. "I was terrified," she admitted. "But I learned something out here, child. Sometimes the most dangerous thing in the world isn't a wild animal or a warrior with a painted face. It's a man who has forgotten his own honor. And the strongest thing in the world isn't a fortress or a firearm. It's a promise between friends." Her gaze drifted to the mantelpiece inside, where a small, polished wooden box sat. Inside it lay a collection of hawk feathers, a lifetime of silent messages. The legacy of the Triple T wasn't just in its herds or its acres. It was in that box. It was in the enduring story of a fragile peace, a testament to the fact that even in the most brutal of times, courage could be answered with honor, and the echo of a single act of kindness could last a lifetime. The story of Eliza Jane Thompson and Goklia is a powerful reminder that the true history of the West was not just written by gunslingers and cattle barons, but by the quiet courage and unbreakable spirit of ordinary people caught in extraordinary circumstances. It's a testament to the idea that honor, friendship, and respect can be found in the most unexpected of places, bridging the divides of culture and prejudice. Theirs is a legacy not of conquest, but of connection, a fragile peace earned through mutual sacrifice. If this tale of defiance, honor, and an unlikely alliance in the heart of the Wild West has captured your imagination, please take a moment to support our channel. Hit that like button to let us know you enjoyed the story. Share it with others who appreciate epic historical dramas, and most importantly, subscribe to our channel for more tales from the untamed frontier. Your support allows us to continue bringing these incredible stories to life. Thank you for listening.